we're going to move to our next session, and this is data and gender, the evidence gap. You can't change what you don't count. And this session is going to be led by Sheila Watson of FIA Foundation. Sheila?
Welcome to this panel on the issues around the evidence gap, particularly in relation to gender and transport. I think as a sector, and sadly at every level, the transport sector has a pretty poor record on female participation, although I'm very delighted we're pretty predominant on this panel, and of course this week's conference, the Flown conferences, are very much gender focused. But obviously the most important thing in making change in a sector is to have good data. That's something that we at FIA Foundation, I'm the Deputy Director, Sheila Watson of FIA Foundation, which is a UK-based charity supporting work on safe and sustainable mobility. And as I say, the most important thing is good evidence. And so today's panel, and we're very lucky to have 4 great speakers who have experience across the breadth of mobility and great experience as researchers. We're going to be able to delve down into that evidence and where the gaps are. So without any further ado, and I will introduce each speaker in more detail as they speak, we're going to start with Heather Allen, and Heather is an expert in the field of gender and sustainable mobility, has been working in the field for many years now, beginning at UITP, then at TRL, the UK-based research consultancy, and now as an independent consultant. And I'm very excited to say that today we are launching a report. I hold it up, it's back to front, no doubt, but it's on our website, the FIA Foundation website, a report on the evidence gap. And we're very lucky that Heather's going to present that for us now. So Heather, over to you, and I'm running the slides. So if you can just say next slide to me, then hopefully I'll be an able assistant.
Thank you very much, Sheila, and thanks also for the nice introduction. This actually is my 3rd Flown conference, so I'm really excited to be here again, and I really appreciate the effort that Flown in particular has been making to increase the visibility of the need of working on gender and transport from all the different angles, of which Sheila mentioned a couple. There are a lot of accepted things that people know about women's movements, particularly in the urban area, and everybody feels that these are well grounded. They're the evidence that is used to include gender, as it were, in transport planning and investment in projects. And these include that women make numerous short walking trips, numerous short trips, period, in fact. The way they use public transport is very often trip chaining between short different trips. Many of them are care related, of course, but they're also work and education related. And that's the difference between women's trips and men's trips, is that there is a complexity and that there is an interconnection between the caring roles, called the reproductive roles sometimes, and the productive roles, which is the kind of employment and jobs action. To some extent, there are a number of studies as well that show that women tend to use buses more than rail. And there's a logic to this, of course, because of the profile of their trips. Buses make shorter stops between distances. It's also logical and accepted that women's transport behavior is more affected by life stages. So with children, they have more trips. As they get elderly, they maybe make less trips. They have different profiles of trips. They go to the hospital more often because they accompany children for immunization. They accompany their parents for, different things. And just kind of emotionally, in the way that we are wired, we tend to be more risk adverse than men. This is shown also in transport driving behavior, where women will actually keep the speed limits a little bit more if they feel it's risky to go above the speed limits. And it's also accepted that infrastructure is not gender neutral. So all that is, let's say, accepted practice. But actually, when you actually come down to it, the reality is so much more complex. And planners and investors really still retain a number of misconceptions around how women will use transport. And a lot of that is also that if it's available, everybody will use it, and that women use it only in off-peak times or more in off-peak times. So this international review tried to take the lid off a little bit, to look deeper into, well, how do women get around cities particularly, and what is the state of the transport data that we have about their movements? So this is the research question that we tried to answer in this rapid review. Is the current state of data collection providing the best evidence on which to base inclusive, women including, transport policy development? So this international study collected the responses via an internet survey and a number of interviews from around 140 transport professionals that on the first basis use data on a regular basis. They came from really all the sectors, academia as well as practitioners. They came from all regions. And this information was also, I need to just highlight that it was really collected pre-COVID. But the difference, and I think this is a big difference, that maybe this is the very first time that women transport professionals had actually been asked their opinions about the quality and quantity of transport data. This was actually not something that we set out to do, or I didn't set out to do, certainly. But the information to take part in the survey was sent out to a very wide number of invitees, also publicized on Twitter and LinkedIn and other social media platforms. But the people who came back were mainly women. A number of men did, and I'm very grateful for that. And we tried to make kind of interviews with men to make sure that we needed validation of these kinds of findings that we had. So generally, what did they think about the quality of the data that we currently collect? So this is really I think a really interesting slide, because it does show that actually there is room for significant improvement, 46%, generally mediocre and incomplete. And if you actually combine all those three totals, you come to around 60%. So 60% of the women's transport professionals felt that the data we currently collect is basically poor. And 38% felt that it was kind of okay, good enough. So if we're looking at do we actually collect the right level of data that cover all social groups? So if we're actually going to try and plan transport to be inclusive, we need, and we have, since transport planning, you always recognize the underserved groups, and that's supposedly brought into the project development and project investment. Very rarely have I seen public transport investment saying that it's not actually going to benefit the poor, as they call them, maybe. So thinking about the data and information that we use, do we think we have the right level? And this included disabled groups as well. And basically, no, more than 50% didn't think that we had the right level of data. So we don't have the right insights into these different groups of people. What about value for money? Do we collect data in a way that's actually providing value for money? Basically, no. There are many things that we can do that would actually provide better data for better value for money, and I think Justin will pick up on this in one of the presentations. So this big issue of asking that very important question, if they can think about the data and information that we currently collect and use for making gender-sensitive, inclusive transport decisions, which is basically what the majority of cities are trying to do. Would you say that the way we do it now is okay? More than 80% felt that actually this was not the case. So they disagreed with the way that we do it now is basically okay. So the corollary is that it needs to be improved. And I think you can see from 90% reactions, yes, we do need to make significant improvements. So that is really a key takeaway from this rapid review. The other thing that I found very interesting was that when asked if people felt that it just being incomplete was just too difficult to change. No, they felt that there were many things that could be done to improve the data at very low level and low cost. So yeah, I just want to place this in the world stage because gender data is pretty poor across all sectors and in every area really. And yet in the Sustainable Development Goals, gender is really one of the core components of many of the SDGs. And transport is one of the core enablers of achieving many of those goals. So if not only the gender data generally is poor, and then our transport gender data is poor, we really do need to make some changes. So these were the key findings, and basically it's business as usual is not an acceptable future. We need to make deep changes. But there is also a recognition that data is not an end in itself. It's only one of the tools that can be leveraged to inform decisions. Also, collecting better data on women's needs would be a first step towards inclusive transport development. And it's not what we collect, it's how we collect it as well. So representation really does matter. And Sheila did touch a little bit on that. The gender balance within the sector needs to be addressed. We need to also know how to address it, and we have no baselines at the moment. We need to really try and share between the cities, and I think Lucy has picked this up, and hopefully we'll come up with that. And also there is an impact of the COVID, and I know that Gail will touch on that.
The question that really the point that interested me in what you were saying is not only is this massive inadequacy clearly in place, sorry, I should also have said thank you for what you've just presented, interesting, and for doing the work. But the gap is there, but I think the implications almost go way beyond whether that means transport works for us as women alone. I mean, it seems to me they go to the heart of sustainable mobility, because if, you know, we know women use public transport more, we know women, I think this is true to say, inform the decisions of families much more. If we're telling our kids, girls or boys, that we don't find the sustainable options, the shared options, attractive or acceptable, and no one's changing them for us because they don't know we feel that way, then that seems to me to be a bit of a drawback for everything we're trying to do around the sustainable mobility piece.
Definitely. And there's the evidence base that's used for planning and investment is so flawed in terms of women's needs. You know, that for me is as you say, that key point.
Our next speaker is Justin Quincy from he's CEO of Go Metro, and Justin's based in Cape Town in South Africa, and has a background in the sort of slightly more technical side of things, product design and development. And I think he's going to talk to us now about some of the technical ways in which some of these evidence gaps can be addressed. So over to you, Justin.
Thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity to present and to share our work at Go Metro and Go Assemble. So I think, yeah, leading on what Heather had to say around data availability, there's 2 points to make, which is one, yes, absolutely. The difference in trip taking based on gender is significant, and we haven't had the data to show until now. But also, I think it's also just worth pointing out that gender-related data in transport is not the only data in transport that is poor. In fact, I think as a rule, data in transport is poor. And so I think that the departure point for us, and what I've been obsessing about for the last 5 years is how do we make better informed decisions, and this is the work that we've been doing. So there's an interesting technology which I want to share with you, and just give you a bit of a background to it. It's this concept of, we call it the urban mobility observatories. We are privileged enough to have a 29 city study going on right now, supported by CAF and IDB across Latin America, where we aim to collect probably the biggest collection of transport data on a continental basis ever undertaken. And we're doing this using innovative technologies and really different technology strategies. And so the first message I just want to share with the audience is technology is not the answer. It could be one of the contributions to the answer. There is no such thing as a silver bullet. There's just many lead bullets. And technology is only one intervention, but you still have to do great project preparation, great groundwork, great design, great development, great integration, great governance, great institutions. Technology doesn't solve the social and institutional issues of transport, but it does help give planners the information they need to make great decisions. It does help give decision makers and policymakers and politicians the right view of what is occurring. And it does give the little man or woman on the street the ability to share their experience and be heard. So our objective of the project is to use technology to try and greatly increase 10 times the amount of data available. Now, how we do that is through a four-step process we call measure, model, manage, move. And at the heart of it is the collection of electronic trip diaries. So we are a good big brother in that we are trying to measure at a very, very fine level the actions on hundreds of thousands of users' phones. Now, how we do that is through a technology we've developed called user movement analytics, which places a little piece of code inside a mobility app in a city, like a Google Maps or a city mapper. And then we have a pop-up that pops up on your phone one morning and says, we'd love to measure your trips today or tomorrow. Would you participate in a survey? The user opts in, and only if they opt in to our study do we then activate our tracking code. And with their knowledge, we collect their information. We also allow them to log in and see what we've collected and have the right to delete it, have the right to amend it, and then submit it. And so we're tracking individual units and individual phones as representatives of humans. This goes into our big modeling engine and allows us to see where general movements are. And then we surface that through mobility indicators. So this new technology allows us to go right down to the phone level of a human and live their whole day's experience with them. So we're also supplementing that because, again, one technology is not the answer. We're supplementing that with digital surveys and USSD surveys. USSD is a technology. It's how you check for airtime. If you dial *101# and you get a little menu that pops up, it's that little piece of technology. So we've got USSD strings that allow us to ask qualitative questions, experience-based questions. And this is another important point about technology, is that you've got quantitative and qualitative, and you have to have a strategy that brings both together. Otherwise, you just end up with a big table of numbers and you make decisions on just the numbers themselves, not the lived experiences. We're looking at third-party data sets and APIs that will help us to really color in the picture. So for instance, where are the supermarkets for those shopping trips? Where are the childcare facilities for those pick up the kid trips? Where are ATMs to withdraw earnings? Where are workplaces? What type of workplace is it? Industrial or white collar? And so using other data sets to augment the data we collect help us color in the picture. And then finally, we head out into the field. You can't do away with the trusty clipboard and paper. You have to get your hands dirty to really get a sense of the lived experience on the ground. The machine won't do all the insights and intuition. We still will need the planners to apply their minds and have the lived experience. This is what some of the outputs look like. So in Cape Town, we collected all of the informal transit network movements through this method. And we were able to detect places in the city where the city did not have registered routes. And these routes had grown organically and popped up. And so this data was able to surface the informal sector really well. So it makes the invisible visible. And in the context of today's discussion, this technology can really help surface women's executed trips and the experience, where it's going well, where it's not going well, and the difference in trip taking. That surfaces up in a bunch of indicators. So we have about 29 standardized indicators that we can cut by gender, we can cut by socioeconomic earning level. We can cut by district and area where you reside. So we can start slicing and dicing this data to understand what's happening for a particular user group or segment. So what's really critical is that the methodology is uniform, but we're in 29 unique cities. And so this is the quantitative side of the experience, of the experiment, is standardized for all cities. But the learnings, the real learnings from those cities will be what comes from the qualitative data set, what people are saying on the ground, what the issues are around how safe they feel, how clean the street is, how late they are willing to go out and venture out and take trips, preferred modes, etc. So it's really important that we bring those two together. And so what we're finding is that travel behavior is very varied. Now, this is stating the obvious and has been reported by the research, but we finally have the breadcrumbs that show that male trips and female trips differ greatly. And they differ by what we already have confirmed, which is destination, trips, duration, and responsibilities. The policies need to be structured around more than just the trip itself. It's the perception of safety or the perception of the experience that is as important as how much was the fare and how many transfers did you take. And I think one criticism of the current state of technology would be we focus too much on how much was the fare, how long was the trip, how many transfers. The engineers are running the show a little bit, and we should rather be asking, how safe did you feel? What stopped you from going out? Are there trips you are not doing because you don't feel that you should or can be doing them? And so it's really the qualitative questions which we are hoping to unlock through the additional surveys. And then there just aren't enough surveys. We've been trying to benchmark and baseline our data sets, and there just simply is not enough of a body of knowledge from surveys with a gender perspective. And where they are done, they're treated as like a specialist study or something we bolt onto a project or we do at the end, or we try and just put a thin layer on. And so certainly we're struggling to benchmark our research and our data collection because the aspect of gender data collection is not as important or as central as it should be in every study and every methodology. Now, I'm sure you want to see what this looks like. So I pulled out an example of a trip. And so what you can see here is the breadcrumb trail of a user's movements through a city, and the concentration of dots, where those dots go very black and very, very dark, is where they are dwelling. So those are origins or destinations. And so the very dark spot is their home, their residence. And then you can see that this person, went and stopped along the way. That coordinate where there's a concentration of dots is a shop. And then there's another stop, which is a daycare center. And so it's by mapping the destination data with the trip data that we're able to understand what the purpose of each leg of the trip was, which now reveals at an unprecedented level what amount of time is spent doing these trips. So yeah, so just in conclusion, I think technology has a lot of potential, but we need to integrate it really closely with more rigorous methodologies that really address the issues and don't just pay lip service to the difference in travel between the genders. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justin. That's incredibly interesting. And it always is, isn't it, when you get down to that granular level of detail to see what people really do. And I couldn't agree more about qualitative and quantitative. I'm curious, if you don't mind me asking, but you said that you ask people if you can track them, which obviously makes sense. What sort of return rate do you get? Are people open to this?
Yes, so it's got all to do with the messaging and the purpose. People are very open to help each other, especially now with the pandemic and what we've all gone through globally. But we find that the clearer the message, and when people know what the data will be used for, there's absolute generosity. So our acceptance rates exceed 50%, whereas you'll find acceptance rates for location-based advertising or other services are between 10 and 15%. And so our penetration rates are very high.
That is incredibly interesting. there are privacy issues always in these things, and I find we've done lots of work where we've had to sort of track individual vehicles and so on, different work, but you know, similar objectives, in other words, trying to clean up cities and make them safer and more sustainable. And privacy laws differ in different places, so I do wonder as well how applicable this would be in other places outside of where you've worked, but it's just got massive potential. It's really interesting. Thank you so much, Justin. And you mentioned COVID, and it would be, of course, a strange session that didn't touch on COVID somewhere. And of course, it's had an impact in all of the areas that we're worrying about. And that's something I think Gail is going to talk to us about now. In particular, I think in relation to women in Africa, which of course, again, a massive focus of the conference this week. So over to you, Gail. Before I say that, though, I ought to introduce Gail properly so that we all know who she is. And she is a research consultant, a social scientist. My husband's one of those, the very best kind of scientists, I always think, whose work I think has focused particularly on user needs, and that's what you're going to tell us about in relation to African women and COVID. So over to you, Gail. Thank you.
Thank you. I think my presentation will be very short, because essentially what this research looks at is, considering that these were all the challenges that we already know about the way women move, that Heather talked about in her second slide, and what Justin was talking about. So we look at what do we know about what women need, how women's needs are not met, and how women travel. And then along comes COVID and particular mobility constraints and the kind of transport challenges of COVID. Well, we were interested in looking at how these fed right in to all the transport disadvantages that women were already experiencing, and what the impact was of this, and to what extent did this compound the challenges that women were already experiencing. So I'm going to share my screen, and now, of course, I tested this how many times before, and now my document is not there. so anyway, well, I'll just have to talk without it. But
we can, I think, share slides later, just jumping in, so others will be able to see them, Gail.
Okay, that's very frustrating. But this is work that both Heather and I are working on, and it's funded by the HVT Applied Research Program, which is a UK aid. And what we were particularly interested in looking at is, to what extent have the lockdown or kind of COVID mobility constraints affected women in particular? And to what extent have women experienced setbacks differently to men during these particular constraints that everybody has experienced, but how have these affected women differently? And we were interested also in trying to understand, were these taken into account at all when the relevant authorities drafted the regulations or considered the way in which mobility should be constrained? So were women's needs taken into account? How were these regulations looked at, other than simply a kind of high-level public health intervention? And how have women experienced these? In what way have they experienced challenges? And if they were to put into practice or put into place constraints, if there were a second lockdown, what would they recommend that happened instead? But also what we were interested in is once again, if we were planning transport interventions from the beginning, what would women want? So, that's a fairly general question, but it was interesting asking or talking to women about how have they experienced this additional mobility constraint, and what does that make women wish for in the big picture. So we didn't have a particularly long time frame in which to conduct this research, because we want the outcomes to get out there as quickly as possible. So we didn't have the fantastic kind of software that Justin was using. What we did is really focus on literature review and social media review, seeing what has been written about this, what can we find out in that way, and then interview women who represented women's organizations or commuters in 4 countries: South Africa, Nigeria, Uganda, and Kenya. And by and large, we found that to some extent exactly what we were expecting to find. So that is really the challenge, is that already we are just making it clear that the lack of information and the lack of decision making around women's needs has just been compounded during 2020. But it's a lot more difficult for women to just bounce back in that sense. So women already suffered from the transport disadvantage before, and were possibly slowly kind of finding their way out of this kind of situation and perhaps making some gains in terms of social inclusion and meeting their needs. So perhaps making slow gains, although that's never as fast as we would like. But now the setbacks have, how easy is it going to be for women to claw back from that? And what really should happen? And in terms of findings, our research isn't complete, but perhaps what has I was going to say troubled Heather and I the most in the findings so far, if troubled is the right word, is that it's so much of what women want, or so much of what women say would help them, is what we already know. So there's nothing remarkably new, in the sense that it's simply do what we have been asking for, ask us what we need, do what we want. There's no massively new kind of understandings, other than that these needs are desperate and they are unmet and they are not being attended to fast enough. So, you know, there have been particular issues around access to healthcare, and there have been instances of women dying, in particularly pregnant women, in being unable to access healthcare. But again, those are problems or challenges that women have been experiencing and asking for assistance for almost as long as we have been trying to understand what women's needs are. So if anything, it shows the kind of before, the work that Heather was doing, and the during COVID, looking at women's needs have not changed dramatically, but it has become even more urgent and even more evident that these needs need to be met. And I think I'll leave it there, because we can discuss that further, and I can answer specific questions. But yeah, so we have increasing data and evidence about what women need, but it has not yet been enacted.
Thank you, Gail.
And I do apologize for my loud birds in the background.
No, well, I was about to say how beautiful it is to have birds during a presentation. That's beyond. That's absolutely lovely. But I think it is perhaps not surprising, but you know, a system that doesn't work for women in normal days, in extremis doesn't work either. Yeah. Well, you know, there we are. That's not a surprise. But I think what's very concerning is that with so many women working as key workers and relying on mobility even during that lockdown, not all being locked away, then those extremes and those setbacks that you described are all the more alarming. And as you say, we can talk about that a little more. But if I may now, I'll just go on to our final, last but not at all least, speaker, to Dr. Lucy Mahoney, who's speaking to us from here in the UK and works as the walking and cycling lead for C40 cities.
Before I share some examples of how data, gender and mobility have begun to be better addressed in certain cities around the world, I wanted to highlight a recent interview with the American actor, comedian, writer, producer and playwright Tina Fey. She was recently interviewed by the US television host David Letterman. It doesn't matter if you have never heard of Tina Fey and if you don't know who David Letterman is. What's important here is the message. So we hear about women struggling to get a seat at the table or get into the decision-making room. But many women are actually also struggling to even get into the building, particularly when it comes to male-dominated sectors such as transportation and, in fact, acting and writing. So in her recent interview, Tina when asked about the challenges of, for years, being the only woman in the writing room or when producing a show, said a lack of women in the room only perpetuates a further lack of women. And this perfectly links to the findings of Heather's report. And Tina goes on to explain more in a really articulate and nuanced way. So think of this scenario. Tina is a comedic actor and writer. If other people in the writing room don't find her work funny, it doesn't get on stage. So what Tina says is that as more women are represented, there are different ears listening in the writing room. And therefore, material that was considered funny suddenly doubles in size. What started to improve as the chemistry of that room became more diverse, other things played better. As more women got into that room, they would sometimes laugh at stuff that the men weren't purposely not laughing at, but it just didn't appeal to them. It just perpetuates itself. I feel like the more diverse the room, in every way, smoother sailing. So my point here is to emphasize that as women represent over 50% of the global population, that it is vital that they are listened to, that they are in the writing room and they are at the decision-making table, as it's the other half of the story. And women's responsibilities, needs, wants, and even humor can be very different to that of men. So I'd like to share with you some examples of cities who are doing more than most on this topic, those who are prioritizing gender-based research, but who are also finding ways to ensure diversity across every level of decision-making in the transport field. Buenos Aires have decided to really focus on inclusivity and are trailblazers in terms of gender and mobility. The city recently published their Gender and Mobility Plan, 2020 to 2023, which has 4 key priorities. 1, planning, design, and management with a gendered perspective. 2, employment placement of women in the transport and mobility sector. 3, data and studies of everyday women and security with a gendered perspective. And 4, training and awareness with a gendered perspective. Buenos Aires have dedicated city officials working on gender and mobility and have launched a communications campaign on gender and harassment. Surveys were conducted with results demonstrating that 100% of women interviewed had suffered some form of street harassment in their life. They have also launched a report on these findings, as well as an emotional support phone line and text messaging service for women who suffer harassment on transport and in public spaces. They have also set up a targeted recruitment campaign to attract women to jobs in the transport sector. In the past, Mexico City found that they too were struggling to capture data on how women navigate their city. So Mexico City are implementing lots of projects to improve public safety and security, encourage women to use bicycles for their independence and physical and emotional health. But they've also launched a great project to help improve the presence of women cycling, the safety and security of women cycling, and to reduce the fear of crime for women whilst cycling. They have also combined their efforts to improve the representation of women working in the mobility field and women working in the police service. So last year, in 2019, the city employed 100 female officers from the city's bike police patrol to enforce and provide a visible presence across the city, but particularly on Paseo de la Reforma, a major avenue in the city. Among their duties, officers direct traffic, attend collisions, administer first aid, and accompany the frequent protest marches along the avenue. Common offences include motorists blocking bike paths and electric scooter users riding on pavements. One officer is quoted as saying that a lot of people break the rules, not because they want to, but because they don't know the law. In addition to issuing warnings, the officers also provide advice such as telling people cycling to not wear headphones whilst riding. And the way that this message is received and accepted is different than if the messenger was a male police officer. The women all receive special training for their roles, and it is emphasised that they too need to set a good example on and off duty, such as not cycling through red lights. The data that these women collect through verbal warnings and also through fines, through handheld devices, helps the city monitor these routes for crime and bad behaviour, but also offers an enhanced presence of women cycling on city streets. Finally, I wanted to highlight this study undertaken through C40's Women for Climate initiative in collaboration with the City of Sydney. This study fills a crucial gap in collecting gender-sensitive data in supporting the city to apply a gender lens to urban transport strategies and towards building a more inclusive city. Women from all backgrounds, all ages and ethnicities were surveyed to understand how Sydney can increase the number of women who walk and cycle as part of their everyday journey. The report's 5 recommendations for the city include: 1, challenge perceptions to increase women's participation and confidence. 2, don't be gender blind. Apply a gender lens that considers the needs of women when designing walking and cycling infrastructure and other transport measures. 3, plan for safety beyond street lighting and separated cycleways. 4, build end-of-trip facilities and women will walk and cycle. And finally, 5, work hand in hand with public transport, as we all know that women's ridership on public transport is particularly high. So cycling, but more importantly, walking trips need to be well integrated and as seamless as possible.
Thanks so much, Lucy. That was incredibly interesting to have that quick run around the globe and see what people are doing in this area. I don't think any of us could fail to be excited by the concept of being in the writing room. I think we all have a sense there's a writing room in all of our careers that sometimes we just never got let into. And I love the idea that when you get in there, it all just gets better. I think that does rather come to the point I was sort of trying to make earlier about sustainable mobility. We make it all better if you do it across all groups. And of course, we should emphasize that's not just a gender thing, but it's also about the less abled and the most economically disadvantaged, the groups that never quite get to that writing table. So I think that's very interesting. I was also interested in what you said about the female police enforcement officers in Mexico City, because I read something about London once. We have a terrible track record on cycling injuries, and that it was more women who were hurt cycling in London because they obey the traffic rules. So they sit at the red light and they wait for the left turning traffic, so they're next to the left turning traffic. And sadly, that meant that they were more often injured. And they quite frankly said the reason more women are caught up in those accidents is because women were obeying the rules more. So there were so many different ways, aren't there, that gender applies. We've got about 10 minutes now in which to have a bit of a discussion around what we've heard, I think, and what we've shared. And if I may, I'd like to just kick off with a thought, and it's sort of lay behind the work that Heather was doing with us in the report that we are launching today, which is there is a gap, and it's a big gap in many ways. Where would you start? What would you advise as a big tip, a first step, particularly in Africa? I think this conference is an African focused event, and we should bear in mind, that everywhere's different. So I don't know, Justin, you're doing some data collection, but in terms of working with governments and authorities, where do you think they should start with this complex set of issues?
Yes, so I think it's worth just reiterating, or just I didn't mention in my presentation, but the Mobility Observatory that we're running in Latin America, we've also been very fortunate enough to be selected by the High Volume Transport Research Program to launch and run a mobility observatory in Africa. And we've now kicked it off. We've got 10 cities that we are scoping, and we plan to at least get 6 up and running and measuring in the next few months. And it's been very interesting in the experience that we've had going from Latin America to Africa. And there, I think, are 2 very different trends that are worth reporting to the conference. One is that government liaising and research and data collection in Africa is an area that needs a lot of policy intervention, policy awareness. Governments, I think, are not necessarily doing enough to let research happen in these countries. We've had to have a number of bureaucratic hoops to get started with a lot of data collection. So there's a lot of regulatory and policy bureaucracy which we can immediately try and address. But what's positive, though, is the mobile technologies available to us in Africa are better than anywhere else in the world. We've been able to work very proactively with mobile networks that surprise us with their innovation. We meet with their innovation teams, and they're busy measuring people and cities. And for instance, now we've just received access to mobile money transaction records, which was a data set we never imagined would be possible. So I think the opportunity and Africa has gone digital, and it's gone digital at an unprecedented scale. So there certainly is a lot of records available. So on the one side, we're very positive engaging with mobile networks, but on the other side, it behooves the entire industry, I think, and the entire sector to really focus on capacity building and policy at a national and regional level across Africa to unlock the power of data. It's not a statutory requirement, it is an enabler for better planning. And so it's not something that must be done in a 3-year planning cycle. It's really something that needs to be done proactively and continuously. And so capacity building across African cities with officials about the importance of data in planning is a really important action.
Thanks, Justin. Heather, do you have thoughts on that? Where would you start? What would be your big tip?
Yes, I think, what we've found is that we've recognized the existing challenges, but the difference that I see today, having been in the sector for a while now, is that there are now solutions. We didn't have those solutions even 10 years ago. So I find that a really exciting nexus, as it were. And actually, COVID has done us, I think, a little bit of a benefit in this way. It has made cities change their thinking. They realized that actually the transport policies that they were hardwired to and felt that this was the way to make their city the best city in the world to live in, actually did not deliver in the COVID pandemic. And so I think that has given us an opportunity for an opening in their mind to change the way. And now we have some evidence that change is possible. It's not expensive. In fact, it's going to give you better value for money. And actually, it's quite doable because people are now beginning to work in this sector. So I think that is really, really encouraging. And the other thing is I'm absolutely, thanks so much, Lucy, for bringing up those cities. The work that's going on there is really fabulous. And I don't know if you could put up the last slide of my presentation, the actual last slide, Sheila, because we worked in Buenos Aires now probably 5 years ago, and I was in close collaboration with the city governments, and the next one, and in the work Ela se mueve segura, I can remember talking to the city governments at that time in Buenos Aires saying, yes, well, it'll be nice to do something on women. Yes, we realize that the sexual harassment is a real problem, but we're not necessarily going to do very much about it. And just look how that has now changed. It's been a wave of change that's come from different angles, but it's absolutely fantastic what they've done. And what we've got now is really clear examples of what can be done and why it's necessary and how successful they can be. on the FIA website, you'll see those reports, and everyone can download them. So I just thought it was worth highlighting that.
Thanks, Heather. No, absolutely. And it was the thought that struck me too when Lucy was talking about her cities, because they are cities in which we've worked. I believe GIZ, the German government, and others have worked and tried to do. So I do think there is some degree of momentum. But Gail, I'm interested as well in your thoughts on where next. For example, in Cape Town, where you're based, do you think that African cities have a receptiveness on these more specific issues of harassment and so on? And particularly in the context of public transport, where maybe the one biggie that changed because of COVID is that acceptability of public transport and shared mobility because of infection. But of course, we know it was also the place where there was a degree of issue around harassment. So do you think that these sorts of examples that Lucy and Heather are sharing would have traction in, for example, the African city you're based in?
I think the challenge is that by and large, African cities have not seen that their kind of current transport practices are the wrong trajectory. So we haven't really seen, well, particularly in South Africa, there has been zero attempt at any kind of change in the terms of pop-up infrastructure. Walking and cycling were in fact explicitly prohibited as means of transport. It was really quite astonishing during COVID. So that was something that was again quite troubling, that there seemed very little interest or inclination to build on any learnings through COVID and have a look at how we should design cities differently. There have been, in fact, walking to the shops, for example, during COVID was really frowned on. I mean, it was seen as being some kind of a bizarre loophole to try and sneak in some exercise when you should be staying at home. So that has been something that has been quite disappointing, really, in that it hasn't really seemed to have given, cities haven't taken it on as a way of building back better, really. But in terms of harassment, again, there really hasn't been much interest in that as a consequence of any discussion around public transport. In South Africa in particular, the main issue that arose in terms of transport and COVID, the big issue on the table, has been subsidization of the paratransit sector. That otherwise the issues around transport and women and gender have not really made it to the public discourse at all. More so in Uganda, because there seems to have been a much bigger backlash. In fact, what seems to have happened in that countries where public transport fares were increased or doubled, which didn't happen in South Africa. There were threats, but it didn't happen. Then transport and the various issues got onto the table in terms of the public discourse, but not really in South Africa. Justin, you might have seen differently, but to me it's been quite disappointing how the economy, whatever that might be, and the issues around subsidization of the paratransit sector were really the main issues. Everything else kind of got ignored. But Justin might have been looking in different mediums and seen something different.
Yes, just with regards to has this changed, or as COVID accelerated the African transport agenda? Absolutely not. The competent bus operators, I think, are on their knees. The practice, just the quality of being able to launch and run fleets in Africa and in South Africa is decimated. South Africa is a skill base for the rest of Africa, where diesel mechanics come from, where secondhand vehicles come from, where a lot of skill sits, and our luxury and tourist coach market is gone. And I'm not sure when or how it comes back. Our bus operators have had to drag their operations through. And I mean, our government in South Africa has saved a lot of money on subsidies because they haven't run buses, but they haven't handed that over as rescue funds to bus operators. They've promised a subsidy that's very focused on the informal transit operator, and really has not thought about the passenger. And now the operator is normally 95+% male, and the passenger is 60+% female. And so there's a real need for passenger-oriented and commuter-oriented subsidization or support, which is simply not present. In the rest of Africa and other African cities, we've had the banning of the minibus taxi completely in Harare. People are now boarding tipper trucks because that is the way that they can get to work. So there's been a collapse in the informal sector by banning it outright, with this fear of COVID spreading through the minibus sector and the informal transit sector. And so the trajectory to just provide quality public transport for all, male or female, has gone back a number of years. And there's an urgent need for development funds not to focus on building BRT lanes and pouring more concrete in Nairobi, Kinshasa, DRC, Kigali. Stop pouring concrete and start investing in bus operators and doing user-based subsidies using smart payment technologies so that we can get cash to the vulnerable in our society and they can board safe and reliable transport. Let's stop pouring concrete.
Yeah, well, a very kind of apposite conclusion, Justin. Yes, I mean, pouring concrete also tends to be quite a masculine thing to go around doing, and may well be a product of that may be a terrible judgmental comment by me, but it also tends to be a product of not knowing just what you said earlier, which is the passengers are 60%, and it's not them who are being thought about. I'm going to go to Lucy next and ask you just to do that, a couple of minutes, and then we'll draw the session to a close.
Thanks, Sheila. I think for me, so I started my career in transport and mobility just over 10 years ago. And often at the beginning, I was the only woman in the room. And sometimes I was one of two or three. And it's a totally different world now. So, you know, even though we still feel like we are in a struggle, it is changing. It just changes slowly. And I really wanted to kind of just highlight Heather's report. It was, you know, please read it. It's such an important report, and it's something that I think is very, very unique. You know, asking women who work in transport to respond, and I responded to the questions that were set out. And a few weeks ago, I also took part in an international hackathon, which is like a thinkathon, which is like a hackathon, but you don't need tech skills. And it was with an organization called 0 to 1 Data, who are an online community of women in data and tech. And this was the first time in my career where I was asked about my experiences and my reflections on how I navigate my city, which is London. And having this opportunity was incredible, because for the first time ever, I was seeing how I act in various scenarios. I never get my telephone out in the street. I feel far safer cycling through an area than I do walking. And I'd never really appreciated that actually I need to express my thoughts and opinions as well. And so I think my big tip would be to get more women working in your offices, in your departments, and ask them for their experiences and how they navigate their cities. And it's all about the diversity, really, just to get a better group of people making decisions and reflecting on experiences, and cities will be for the better for it.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Heather, would you like to add a few comments?
Thanks. Yes, just really quickly, I think that what came out very, very clearly from this work and other work as well is that, you know, and we knew it all along, pouring concrete is not the only answer. Infrastructure is not the only answer. And in fact, it's probably less of an answer now than it was 2 or 3 years ago. So let's stop the 90% investment in infrastructure and 10% investment in people, and switch that around to actually understand what people and all people need from transport. And then I think we can develop and build and design our infrastructure in a much better way. And I think Africa in particular, because it is digitalized and it is actually at a kind of pivotal point in its development, has got a real opportunity to leapfrog in data collection. And I just hope that there are enough visionary and committed people at the top level in African cities and in African governments to take up this opportunity, because it would make a real difference to Africa. So the international community actually, I think, has something to do with that as well, because the multilateral development banks only do what the countries ask them to do. And if it's only men that ask the questions, then that's all we're going to get, and that's pouring concrete.
Thanks, Heather. Gail, would you like to say something?
I think to reiterate what our research was showing is that although there are substantial evidence and data gaps, we also do know a great deal. And many of the needs and the concerns that women voice, they have been voicing for a long time. So a lot of it is not new and hasn't yet been acted on. So although there are substantial evidence gaps, that's not an excuse to sit back and wait until more research has been conducted or wait until we have different data. You should act on what we know already. And as Heather was saying, we do need to hope for champions in this arena who are committed to making a difference and to serving the needs of all transport users.
Thanks, Gail. That's a very important positive, that there is information there, but it's no use if you don't pay any attention to it. Justin, I feel like you gave us your rousing last moment. So if you'll forgive, you started us off on this people, not concrete, in an excellent way. So I think as our time is now pretty much up, I will simply close by thanking all of you for your time, taking part in the conversation today, and for sharing the work that you do, each and every piece of which is incredibly valuable. The report which we're launching today, which Heather authored, can be found on our website. It's called Counting Women, so that women count, and our website is fiafoundation.org, and hopefully you'll look at it and the many other bits of evidence that the presenters today have shared, and find something useful coming out of it. But I think our conclusions must be, it's people, not concrete. There is some evidence, but there are some gaps, and the energy in this issue and the whole issue of women in transport is high, and we need more women in the sector. So that's a bit of a summary. Hopefully you've all enjoyed our conversation, and I think that brings us to a close. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheila Watson, Lucy, Gail, Justin, and Heather, for a very, very informative session that we've had. Some of the questions that were asked on our chat session, some of them have been answered personally, but I'd like to read them out loudly so that if any of the panelists are still here, they could still answer them loudly for everybody. An anonymous actually, she says, she's Jennifer from Uganda, says, data collection, especially about women, is lacking. When you contact government agencies, most of the time they don't reach the grassroots. Furthermore, maybe some conflict of interest. I would suggest that you try as much as possible to reach the grassroots. And I believe Heather answered her. I don't know if Heather would want to make your answer public also to everybody else, to the rest of the participants. Heather?
I did say, yes, absolutely, we agreed entirely on that. But one of the issues is that actually the people who collect data and who are responsible for collecting data tend not to think that collecting data around women will actually deliver anything interesting. They just see women's movements as being off-peak and being proxy men movements, really, and they're only interested in collecting data around commuters. So it is a real problem, and we need to change that mentality, both in the ministries of transport, but also in the ministries of statistics. So that might be helpful. Thank you for that good question.
There's a question here for Gail, so I'll have Sheila maybe take that one. And the question is that, Gail, thank you very, very much for a good presentation regarding your findings. It's not very clear what type of data you've collected and how you did get to the conclusion the COVID is not bringing anything new. Could you please provide more information about the method and how you actually got to this conclusion? I feel like this question should specifically be answered by Gail, but any of the panelists willing to take that?
I think, good morning, everyone. This is Sheila Watson. I think that might be most appropriately led by Heather. She's part of that study. But before I ask Heather to do that, if I can just jump in and say that the FAA Foundation, of which I'm Deputy Director, which is sponsoring the report that's been launched today on the data gap, really sees this as an important evidence gap, and policy will never be the best it can be if you don't base it off the best evidence that you can gather. So really, I don't think you can overstate the importance of what might appear quite a dry issue. And I have to say, from the comments I've been seeing coming in, many of the attendees here today see this gap as well. But let me hand over to Heather on the specifics of that data.
Right. Thank you, Sheila.
Thanks. Sorry, I don't want to try and answer everything, but I was obviously working with Gail on that report. And basically our methodology was a literature review, but also outreach to a number of individual interviews with people to gather their on the ground experience, but also representative bodies, as it were, that would be able to speak for a number of the voices of women. And Gail was what she maybe didn't make quite clear was that there was no dramatic new news, as it were, in the needs of women, but was more dramatic and has really been made desperate for some, is the need to actually do something about the poor level of transport for women, and that everything that was not going terribly well before has just got a lot worse with COVID. And that's really the issue. And particularly around fares in South Africa, it wasn't quite so bad, but in other places, women are really not going to use public transport nearly as much. So their transport horizons are much smaller. They can't travel with children, which again is a big problem. And also there was a lot of talk about not sending girls back to school, which is a real key issue. We've made so much progress in getting girls into secondary and tertiary education. But if they are not going to be able to get back to school and get certification, then they're going to have the rest of their lives really in the poor quintiles of the population. So it's a really, really key issue now.
Thank you very much, Heather, Sheila, Lucy, and Gail. This has been a very insightful session. We want to move on to the next session, which is leverage gender and to promote electric mobility. But before I do that, let me read one comment for you, and hopefully you'll be able to send this link as requested. Somebody said, thank you very much to all the panel members. So insightful and great to see two fellow Cape Townian transport research professionals virtually. Please, can you post a link to the Bonacera's gender and mobility plan? So kindly do that. And this is to any of the ladies and gentlemen that have been taking us through this previous session.